project was a research project that jumped on the dual crises that have been happening, the pandemic and COVID-19 and climate change. So this project is a pretty big collaboration between Glasgow Caledonian University in Scotland, Muzuzu University in Malawi, and University of Rwanda here in Rwanda, as well as several other universities in Malawi and NGOs also in Rwanda. So it's quite a large and multidisciplinary collaboration, and the project is trying to look at the impacts of both of these events, the pandemic, COVID-19, and climate change, and how in particular rural communities are dealing with these impacts. The project hopes to achieve several objectives. One of them is to understand how rural communities are dealing with what is happening now with the impacts of COVID-19 and climate change. So for climate change, these would be changes in rainfall, changes in temperatures. Rainfall could be heavier rainfall that is causing droughts, landslides and flooding, or less rainfall causing droughts. And people have to adapt to that in terms of their farming and agriculture activities, as well as protecting their homes and their infrastructure. And on top of that, dealing with a pandemic which caused a lockdown, which caused increases in prices and changes in daily life. So it's an opportunity to look at how communities can be resilient and adapt to these impacts. The important part of that is that while this event is happening now, most likely there will be other events like this happening, and what we can learn from how rural communities who live very close to the land and are very impacted by events like landslides or droughts and other environmental catastrophes, we can take away lessons to help communities to better be resilient to these kind of shocks and impacts. Some of the early recommendations are, and we are still looking at the data right now, but some of the early recommendations have to do with understanding how people use the land and how they get access to resources, especially locally, that can help them withstand these kind of shocks like closures and abrupt changes in their access to resources or needs in their daily lives. So building in the capability to get access to resources and have a kind of a safety net when these kind of shocks happen is something that we've been learning, and also the different ways that men and women are impacted by these kind of events like climate change events and weather shocks, and also the pandemic and what happened during the COVID-19 closures and lockdowns. Different emerging possibilities from this research. First of all, it taught us as researchers and academics that we could try to continue doing research despite the lockdowns that were happening across different countries, because we were from 3 different countries working on this project, and we had to change a lot of what we had planned to do, but we managed. We used a lot of internet resources to communicate with each other, and we were able to carry out the research. The other part of this is the multidisciplinary approach, which I think is very exciting in trying to understand some of these complex problems that we're facing today. So our team was composed of researchers from the College of Medicine and Health Science, as well as the College of Science and Technology, and the College of Agriculture and Animal Health and Veterinary Medicine, as well as practitioners from NGO. So we put together this very interdisciplinary team of natural and social scientists and practitioners to launch this project and work together to try to understand this problem from different angles. And I think another important part of this is to approach research in a way that is participatory. That was one of our aims. It did become more difficult as we were limited in sometimes in our access to the field due to the COVID-19 protection measures. But I think this is also a really interesting opportunity in research, especially when you're looking at problems that deal with how communities are being impacted and how they are adapting. Doing this research in a participatory approach, I think, is a really important way to get information that can really help community as well.
My involvement and my role, I'm the co-investigator. So as a co-investigator, I'm the lead researcher here in Malawi. I work with the University of Livingstonia and the Life Concern in Lumpi. I'm the one who is working like a nerve center between Scotland and Malawi. So when messages come from Scotland, they are delivered through me, and I'm the one who delivers that message to my colleagues at the University of Livingstonia as well as the Life Concern in Lumpi. I am also involved in the training of the research assistants for them to do correct data collection, as well as I'm involved in the focus group discussions in the community. I've also been part of the team collecting qualitative data at some point. Okay, what we found was that COVID-19 has really affected people on the ground. A lot of participants revealed that their life has gone down because of the coming in of COVID-19. Their businesses are not working. Some of them, because of COVID-19, they're also failing to travel. Even if when someone is sick, they're failing even to take him to the hospital because they're afraid that by taking that person to the hospital, they might get the disease, COVID-19. So that on its own has impacted people a lot. And above all, it has also shown that with coming in of COVID-19, some other breadwinners have passed on. Now, because of the passing on of those breadwinners in the families, it has shown that a lot of family members have been affected. Now, at the same time, climate change, people are also affected heavily with climate change issues. Some of the people, their houses are blown off. Some of them, their houses have been demolished just because of heavy rains. And the others even complained that because of climate change issues, their crops were also washed away by heavy rains. This is something which they were not experiencing before. It has just started coming shortly. Some of the gardens which where their crops are washed away, they are the gardens that they have been using for ages, and they were harvesting very well. But because of climate change issues, those gardens are not used now. So this shows that really climate change has impacted them. Yeah, and a lot of people were pleading to the government as well as to well-wishers to bring help to them. They were asking to say, and even when they saw us telling them about the climate change and COVID-19 issues, they were asking from us that maybe we can lend a hand to them, because some of them were really looking desperate. They didn't know what to do. Yeah. Okay. This research is very important. It's an eye-opener to the government, and of late, I think it's one of the first studies done after the pandemic, digging into climate change issues as well as COVID-19. There have been studies before which are focusing mainly on COVID-19 and only on climate change. But trying to link COVID-19 and climate change this is the first of its kind. Now, to policymakers, I think they need to look into what we have found in this study, so that they can develop some policies to help people in the community. But then to other researchers, I think they need to work more. We have been getting questions from the community where people are asking to say, what's really the link between climate change and COVID-19? Does it mean that COVID-19 is really spreading when it's very cold, or it's very hot, or what happens? I think if a study can be done on whether COVID-19 spreads fast during cold season or during hot season, or what happens, so that people can be well informed on what to do in terms of preventing themselves from COVID-19, as well as trying to help themselves from climate change issues. Yeah.
We all know that climate change impacts are affecting the lives and livelihoods of many people around the planet, and the African continent is no exception. Scientists are predicting more droughts, more floods, outbreaks of pests and diseases that both increase in frequency and intensity. And these effects will have cascading implications for how much money people make, how healthy they are, how much education they can get, and even how early they marry. And now there's COVID-19. We all know too well that the pandemic has had a tremendous impact on public health, but also on the economy, on social relations, and even politics. In sub-Saharan Africa, for people who rely on their incomes in the informal sector, or people who are single heads of households, and other groups such as women, children, the elderly, the unemployed, they are all dealing with these issues in a disproportionate manner. In Malawi and Rwanda, vulnerable groups need to now deal simultaneously with two challenges, that of climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic. But vulnerable groups are notoriously hard to reach, and that's also why we don't have much scientific evidence on how these two challenges compound each other and play out in real life. Generating this kind of evidence is at the core of this project called Climate Change and COVID-19. The project is led by the Centre for Climate Justice at Glasgow Caledonian University in Scotland. In Malawi, our partners include Mzuzu University, the University of Livingstonia, and Life Concern Organization, an NGO working with local communities on issues of public health and environmental protection. In Rwanda, we work with the University of Rwanda's Center of Excellence in Biodiversity and Natural Resources Management, as well as Rwanda Village Community Promoters, a local NGO working with local communities on agricultural development. The project itself is funded by the UK government through its Global Challenges Research Fund and the Newton Fund. So in terms of expertise, our team includes geographers, environmental scientists, economists, biodiversity scientists, public health and nursing experts, statisticians, and others. And putting together a very diverse group of experts of this kind was necessary in order to study a very complex social phenomenon such as anthropogenic climate change, and now also a global pandemic. It's also very important to have interdisciplinary expertise to make the connections between these seemingly different challenges. The CCC19 project will have three core objectives. First, we want to assess how the impacts of the global pandemic have affected people's ability to respond to or prepare for the impacts of climate change, what we call climate resilience. Second, we want to assess how effective governmental and local responses to the pandemic have been, and how they have in turn affected how people will or have been responding to climate change impacts locally. Third, we want to establish whether the pandemic and the way in which we have responded to it will have any bearing on how Malawi and Rwanda are able to adapt to climate change or reduce their emissions in the future. Ultimately, we want to co-produce recommendations for updating current and creating new public health and climate change policies that will benefit the vulnerable groups I just mentioned in both countries. In order to do so, we're going to conduct interviews, focus groups, and surveys with hundreds of individuals in both countries. And our participants will include local community members, government officials, and development professionals. We're also going to use digital storytelling to enable local community members to tell us their stories of how they've experienced climate change and the pandemic on their own terms and in their own words. Ultimately, we will take these recommendations and all this evidence back to policymakers and work with them to create policies that will take consideration of the interests, needs, and views of our research participants. We will then take all this evidence to policymakers and decision makers in both countries to ensure that the views, opinions, and needs of the most vulnerable groups are integrated into the development of policies in the aftermath of the pandemic. We'd like to take you along on our research journey and share with you what we found and what we believe the solutions to a sustainable, gender-sensitive, and equitable recovery in Malawi and Rwanda should be.
Ine zina langa ndine Cecilia Mboma, ndachokera ku muzi wa Mwahimba, Principal GVH Mwahimba kwa Bagago. Moyo wanga mene chomwe ndimapanga, moyo wanga wa tsiku ndi tsiku ndimapanga business ya ing'ono ndi kulima. Family yanga mene tili apa ana alipo 6, ineyo ndi bambo. Ndoti pamodzi tipo 9. Mudera muno takhazaka panopo ichi cha namba 35. Munomo mudera lathu muno ndi udindo monga ya motherboard. Zakusintha kwa nyengo ndikhoza kufotokoza kuti zomwe zandikhuza zinthu zasiyana kumbuyo ndi kusogolo pano. Chifukwa kumbuyoko kunali vuto lake timalima zinthu zina timazipezako. Koma mmene zasinthira pano monga ngati vula mmene yakukolokera zinthu mazi, misinja imazaza kwambiri, zambiri zinapita ndi mazi. Ndiponso nyumbaso zimagwaso. Pali ena mwalira ndi mazi, anakokoloka ndi mazi, amafera momo misinja. Pali enaso nyumba zimagwera kusoweka kogona. Ndo pali enaso monga kusintha kwa nyengo ngati COVID-19 panopa ena mabizinesi samatiyendera. Chifukwa chakuti COVID-19 wakhuza aliyense pa nyumba pake. 19 watikhuza monga kuti aliyense timangova kuti ndi nthenda yomwe yabwera yakuti munthu ndi munthu mzake asakhuzane, muzikhala mamita patali otalikirana. Monga kusintha kwa nyengo tayuza kuti munthu pa business yake ayenera kulima mbewu yopambana monga yomwe ikucha msanga. Chifukwa ngati vula kulibe ukalima ngati mbatata ndi chinangwa china chimacha msanga chikhoza ndithandiza pa moyo wanga. Ngati pa COVID-19 imene yavutira pano aliwesa akhoza kupanga business ya ing'ono yakuti munthu akhoza kuti apeze ndalama pa nyumba kugulitsa tomato, muchere. Singati monga kuti mtawuni city mayenda zimativutira patali kuti ukhoza kupeza ndalama yayikulu kwambiri. Koma ka business kochepa timayipeza ndalama mokwanira pang'ono ngati COVID-19 wativutira pano.
Inuyo monga
Ifeyo monga njira yakuti ife tithese COVID-19 mwina tipewe tiyenera kusamba ndi sopo kawiri pafupi ndi mazi. Ndipo kuti titheseretu aliyense tikhoza kukhala ujeni motalikirana mamita mwinaso ndikuvala mamasiki mukamwa. Monga ine nsogolera timathandizana monga ine ndi mafumu kuyitanisa misonkhano kukhala ndi kwamba kuphunzitsa kuti abale anzanga olo muno muzi ndi mzinda tiziwe chopanga ndi ichi. Monga yabwera COVID-19 tiphunzitse olo ana nyumba akamapita ku sukulu aziwe kuti COVID-19 yabwera iyi aliyense akaziwe kusamba m'manja ndi sopo ndi kuvala masiki kukamwa. Monga ngati kusintha kwa nyengo tikufuna kuti munthu akhoza kutithandizira zinthu zoti ngati zipangizo za ulimi. Ngati ku COVID-19 poti munthu zinthu zikusintha timafunako ngati business kuti ngati kamtaji kuti mutipezereko ngati mabungwe oro boma kumene litithandizireko kumtaji wathu kuti ka business kathu kang'ono kaziyenda.
Zina langa ndine Isaiah Chilambo Matengere, ndimachokera mwa GVH Mwahimba. Ineyo ndili pa banja ndimapanga business yake ya ulimi. Kusafikira kwa mazi kunandikhuza chifukwa chakuti dimba langa limodzi linapita ndi mazi. Panopa tinazala mitengo mbali mwa mtsinje kuti ngati sogoloko mazi angazasefukireso. Mitengo yathu ija izatithandize pa nkhani yoti mazi azakhuze mdimba mwangamo. Ngati dera tayizasunjira zake zimozimozi. Tazala mitengo mbali mwa mtsinje. Kubwera kwa COVID-19 yasokoneza kwambiri business yanga chifukwa business yanga ndikakhala kuti ndalima mbewu zanga kumabwera anthu osiyana kuzapikula. Koma panopa chifukwa cha COVID-19 anthu achepa and business yanga sikuyenda bwino komanso kumbali ya school ana akakhala kuti apita ku school amangowabweza wiki ikupita kenaka kwakusasa basi bwerere ku nyumba COVID-19 ngati ine mulimi mavuto amene akhala amene ake atha kusangalala kwambiri chifukwa chakuti business yanga iziyenda bwino and ana azipitanso msukulu monga mmene ankapitira poyamba.
For CCC19, in particular, I am the Gender Equality Officer. And so that means for the project, my responsibility is ensuring that we have gender equity and what's called gender mainstreaming in our research design, in our research outcomes, and in our analysis to make sure that we have equal representation between men and women on the team and also in our participation of our research subjects. During the pandemic, women have faced particular difficulties in the domestic sphere because there is the social norm in Rwanda and many sub-Saharan African countries that women are primarily responsible for food and water provisions in the home. So when you have economic hardships that limit the food supply in the home, that becomes more of a quote-unquote woman's problem, right? Because she's responsible for feeding children. And the other issue with rural women in Rwanda we found is that before the pandemic, when they were free to farm as they needed to, whatever they grew themselves, so it's most efficient for farmers in Rwanda to grow monocrops, which is to specialize in one thing and grow that one product in abundance and grow it well. So what happened during the pandemic, because people could no longer sell their produce because roads were closed, or they weren't free to go trade with neighbors or in marketplaces, they could no longer diversify their diets. And so we see women and children and also men having more of a mono diet with no diversity. And of particular concern, it's too early in the pandemic for us to know, but there is early anecdotal evidence that pandemic conditions might be increasing the rates of gender-based violence. So we've seen this anecdotally in other countries, but in the Rwandan context, what we are experiencing, or we think we're seeing, is that economic hardships create stress for everyone in the family, and that can often manifest as domestic violence. We also see that children who otherwise would be able to be out of the house for hours per day at school are now at home longer, and they might be at home with a parent who is unable to care for them or mistreats them. And then we also know that whenever there is an interruption in an educational trajectory, it is particularly detrimental for girls. So Rwanda has done a really great job in trying to end early in child marriage, and it's been relatively successful, right? But that success is premised on the idea that girls can go to school. It's called opportunity cost. So a family will not have their daughter engage in earlier child marriage because educational opportunities are there, career opportunities are there, and there's something worth giving up that early marriage for. The problem with the pandemic when schools close is now there is no alternative. There's not that better alternative. So now you have families that are in higher rates of poverty, no schools that they can send their girls to, and now suddenly early marriage is a much more attractive option because you get the money that you get from the marriage, that's one less mouth to feed. And so the problem that we're seeing, there might be an indication that the pandemic is interrupting girls' educational trajectories, increasing child marriage, and therefore lowering their educational attainment rates. Equity of outcomes and equity of resources for everyone.
Nitwa Shimimana Natani, nkaba nturuka mu ntara y'Amajyepfo mu karere ka Gisagara, mu murenge wa Musha, mu kagari ka Kigarama, mu mudugudu wa Kabusenyi. Nkaba ndi umuhinzi w'amateke, nkaba ariho mbikorera, nkaba mbimazemo igihe kingana n'imyaka 2. Natangiye mpinga ahantu hangana na hegitari 2, gusa icyo gihe ngitangira umusaruro wari ushimishije, ariko ubu ntabwo ariko bikimeze. kubera ko bitewe n'ibihe uko bigenda bihinduka, bitewe n'imihindagurikire y'ikirere, bitewe n'uko ibihe bigenda bihinduka, habaho igihe cy'izuba ryinshi bituma umusaruro ugabanuka. Urebye nta yindi mihindagurikire ikabije yaboneka cyangwa yabaho uretse kuba hataboneka imvura ihagije. Habaye haboneka imvura ihagije umusaruro wakwiyongera, ariko kubera ko bitewe n'ubushyuhe cyangwa no kuba nta mvura iriho, niyo mpamvu umusaruro utiyongera ahubwo ukomeza ugabanuka. Bitewe n'iki cyorezo cya kovide, ntabwo byashobotse ko n'umusaruro tubonye tuwugeza ku masoko, bikaba byarabaye imbogamizi ku bahinzi nkatwe, kubera ko umusaruro twabonaga twawujyanaga ku masoko tukabona amafaranga runaka yo gukora ibindi. Nuko habayeho kuba ari wo uribwa cyane, kubera ko twagerageje kubyitaho kugira ngo turwanye kuwangiza cyane, bituma tuwurya, bituma ari byo turya cyane. Ku kijyanye no kuba twabasha kugeza umusaruro ku bantu bawukeneye, urumva hagati aho bisaba inzego za leta, kuko nizo zishobora gufungura imihanda cyangwa zikayifunga, zikavuga ko byemewe kugenda cyangwa bitemewe. Ibyo babiharira inzego za leta. Twebwe nk'abahinzi ntabwo twabimenya, kuko ntabwo tumenya ngo igihe kigeze aha barafunga cyangwa barafungura. Bashobora, bitewe n'uko icyorezo kigenda cyiyongera, ntabwo twamenya ngo barafunga cyangwa barafungura.
Njye nitwa Ngendahimana Japhet, nkaba ndi umuhinzi, nkaba mpinga i Gasozi no mu gishanga. Muri aka gace uburyo bundi abantu bifashisha mu buryo babonamo amafaranga buratandukanye. Hari abahinga, hari aborora, hari abacuruza, hari abakora nyakabyizi, hari abafite imirimo ibahemba ku kwezi. Mbona abantu babonamo amafaranga, cyane cyane njye ndahera ku buhinzi kuko aribwo nkora. Iyo imyaka yeze umuntu abasha kugurisha akabona amafaranga. Ahandi hantu mbona abantu bakora amafaranga ni mu bucuruzi. Ubucuruzi bacuruza, nkuko tuba twejeje imyaka dushyira abacuruzi bakayigura, nabo bakayicuruza. Ahandi mbona abantu bakora amafaranga ni mu bworozi cyangwa mu bwubatsi. Ibiza bituruka ku mihindukire y'ikirere nkunda kubona hano muri aka gace ka Bugesera ni ikijyanye n'izuba ryinshi. Izuba ryinshi rimwe na rimwe rigasimburwa n'imvura igwa ari nyinshi, ikagwa nabi, ikaba yakwangiriza abaturage. Abantu bafite ibyago byinshi njye uko mbibona, akenshi ni abagore n'abana. Abagore n'abana ni ba bantu akenshi bakunze gukora imirimo nakwita yuko yoroheje kandi iri hafi, ari nayo ikunda kugirwaho ingaruka n'iyo mihindagurikire y'ikirere. Urugero nk'abagabo nkatweho, iyo bikomeye ushobora gufata urugendo ukajya mu kandi karere ahantu hazima, witwa ko hahahika ukajya guhaha. Ariko umugore n'umwana, umugore ntabwo yafata urugendo ngo agiye mu kandi karere, aguma aho ngaho agategereza uko ibihe bizahinduka. Muri aka gace ibikorwa dukora kugira ngo tubashe guhangana n'iyo mihindagurikire y'ikirere, icya mbere mu buhinzi tugerageza kuvomera iyo izuba ryavuye. Iyo imvura yaguye nabwo tugerageza guca imiferege itwara amazi kugira ngo itangiza ya myaka. Noneho mu borozi nabo bakagerageza guhunika ubwatsi, kubera ko akenshi aborozi nabo mu iki gihe cy'izuba bakunda kugira ikibazo cy'ubwatsi cyane. ubufasha nakenera nkanjye nk'umuhinzi cyane cyane kubera ko kuhira bitugora, badufasha nko kubona ibikoresho twifashisha mu kuhira imyaka. Tugize amahirwe tukabona nk'umuterankunga cyangwa se leta ikagira icyo yadufasha, ikadufasha mu buryo twabonamo uburyo tuvomera, mbona twahangana n'izo ngaruka mbi z'imihindagurikire y'ikirere. Uburyo nagereranya ubuzima bwanjye bwa mbere ya korona n'ubw'uno munsi, impinduka zabayeho zirahari. Mbere ya korona twarisanzuraga, umuntu agakora amasaha yose, agakora imirimo myinshi itandukanye, n'ibyo twahinze bikagira abakiriya, bikabona isoko rihagije, tukabona amafaranga. Ariko ubu nyuma ya korona ibintu byarahindutse. Dushobora no gutanga amafaranga menshi nko kuhira, ariko tukagira ikibazo cy'amafaranga make aboneka mu byo twejeje. Mu byo twejeje, niba ari uko abacuruzi bamwe bavuga ko abacuruzi bamwe bahombejwe na korona bigatuma badagura umusaruro tubona, mbega abari bafite ubushobozi bwo kugura umusaruro wacu tukabona amafaranga, bamwe ntibakibufite, ugurwa na bakeya, tukabona amafaranga makeya kandi twashoye menshi. Ibintu naba nzi kuri coronavirus nuko nzi yuko ari icyorezo kibi cyane kibasiye isi, cyandura vuba kandi cyica abantu vuba. Ingamba leta yafashe yo kuyikumira rero ikatuzitugezaho nkatwe nk'abaturage, dushishikariza cya mbere kwambara agapfukamunwa, cya kabiri kwirinda kujya mu bantu benshi, gukora ingendo zitari ngombwa, gatatu gukaraba amazi meza n'isabune, ufite ubushobozi agakoresha sanitizer. Ikintu nakoze ngo mbashe guhangana n'ingaruka za coronavirus nuko ko nabonye ko ibihe bihinduka, icyo mbonye cyose, umusaruro mbonye wose ngerageza kufata neza, kugira ngo ejo bundi nihasubiraho nka za ngamba zafashwe ubushize zaguma mu rugo, ntazasonza nk'uko nigeze gusonza bitunguranye. Coronavirus yaduhaye amasomo menshi, amasomo navuga yaduhaye bamwe nihereyeho. Isomo rya mbere yaduhaye ni ukutirara. Kutirara kubera ko dushobora gutungurwa isari yose, nk'uko kiza cyatunguranye, na duke tubonye tukagerageza kuzigama. Irindi somo rya kabiri nakuyemo rya mbere niryo kudapinga ibintu, mbega leta yatubwira ikintu tukacyumva nk'ukuri, ko iyo dukurikiza ingamba leta yatubwiye hakiri kare, sinekeza ko iki cyorezo kiba kigeze aho kigeze ubu ngubu. Mbega amasomo yampaye niyo kumvira hakiri kare no gufata neza ibyo nabonye, ku buryo ejo bundi byazangira akamaro mu gihe hari ibiza cyateye nk'uko korona yateye ubu ngubu. Gusa icyifuzo nagira nuko mwadukorera ubuvugizi tukabasha kubona izo moteri zo kuhiza, kugira ngo tubashe kurwanya inzara, ko nabonye ko hari igihe bishoboka amafaranga akabura, ariko tugatungwa na byo kurya twejeje. Mudukora ubuvugizi rero tukabona uburyo tubasha kuhira, byadufasha cyane, ubuzima bwacu bwabasha kugenda neza. Murakoze namwe.
Yeah, we are already having the climate change as an issue, and the climate change is an issue which is already affecting most of the communities in Malawi. And now coming in with the issue of COVID-19 has made the situation now to be more worse. For example, we look at Kalonga Baka area where we have been doing the research, the study. You find that they already have their houses, there's flood, there's water all over, and that automatically affected their livelihoods, that automatically affected their businesses. Now comes in COVID-19 with all those restrictions. People can't even move, and they can't even go and sell their businesses. So automatically, that automatically made the problem of climate change now to be more worse to the communities, because COVID-19 already has a number of issues, restrictions. People can't even go to the market. They can't even go to Tanzania, where they go and sell their products, and they buy something and sell them in Karonga district. So because of COVID restriction, that was not there. So automatically that created a big challenge to the community. So we can say, on top of climate change, the coming in of COVID-19 has made the situation worse to the communities. For example, when you look at the issues of climate change, of course, yes, people have been affected. Now we come in COVID-19, schools have closed, and children cannot even move. Now people, they have been relocated from community X to community Z somewhere. And when they go there, schools are not even operating. They don't even have resources to eat. They don't have food. And they keep their children within the households. And worse enough, you cannot even move from, as the stakeholders, to go and distribute relief items. You need to also to follow all the COVID restrictions. So we are also restricted. They were also restricted. So you can see the challenge that was there, how the communities have been affected with COVID-19. So it's a big issue and it's a big challenge to the communities.
REMA, as an institutional arm of the Ministry of Environment, in terms of climate change, coordinates the implementation of all policies, strategies, and instruments related to mitigation and adaptation of climate change within the country. The main challenge that we experience are linked to those heavy rainfalls which cause landslides and floodings, and the drought, especially in eastern part of Rwanda. During COVID-19 period, the government of Rwanda adopted a recovery plan aiming at guiding the government to conduct some key interventions to allow the economy to recover, but also to support the household and boost the employment and the growth toward the recovery. And among the sectors covered by this recovery plan, agriculture is also included, and some interventions are being implemented to help the population to recover from this situation imposed by COVID-19, this situation of poverty, if I can say. And some interventions are being implemented in terms of climate change adaptation.